Les Misérables, written by Victor Hugo and first published in 1862, is a monumental work of French literature deeply rooted in the social and political challenges of the 19th century. The novel not only provides an impressive narrative about the lives of several central characters, but also explores fundamental themes such as justice, redemption, social inequality, and the effects of the French Revolution. At the heart of the work is Jean Valjean, a former convict whose journey of atonement and redemption forms the core message of the novel. Hugo uses the characters and their personal struggles to highlight the brutality of the class system and the deeply ingrained injustice in society. Les Misérables is not just a depiction of misery, but also a story of hope, love, and the possibility of change, both on a personal and societal level. Les Misérables was first published in 1862 and is a literary masterpiece by Victor Hugo. It is considered one of the most significant works of 19th century French literature and has profoundly influenced both French and international literary history. Hugo, known as a poet, novelist, and political activist, used this work to shed light on the deep societal and political issues of his time. The book is not only an epic narrative about the life of Jean Valjean, a former convict, but also a sharp analysis of the social injustices and moral conflicts inherent in the complex structures of French society. The context of Les Misérables is inseparable from the political and social landscape of 19th century France. Hugo wrote the book during a time when France was marked by political upheaval, including the French Revolution of 1889, which profoundly transformed society. The aftermath of the revolution and the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity shaped public discourse, yet the country was still grappling with extreme social inequality, poverty, and political instability. These conditions are clearly reflected in the themes and characters of the novel. In Les Misérables, Hugo intertwines the personal fates of his characters with the major political movements of his time, including the Industrial Revolution, the rise of social classes, and revolutionary uprisings like the June Rebellion of 1832, which plays a central role in the novel. Hugo shows how the poor and marginalized are often ignored or even oppressed by society and political systems. At the same time, he questions the meaning of justice, morality, and redemption, challenging the reader to critically reflect on societal conditions. Les Misérables addresses central themes such as poverty, the injustice of societal structures, and the power of human goodness that can persist even amidst the greatest adversity. The novel critiques the unjust treatment of the poor and the marginalized and asks what a just society might look like. The society depicted in the early 19th century, as presented by Hugo, is marked by an unfair justice system and a deep divide between social classes, leading to lives of misery and despair for many. This significant work from 1862 is not only a literary masterpiece, but also a social and political manifesto that remains relevant in its questions about social justice and human rights. At the beginning of the novel, Jean Valjean carries a heavy burden: a long prison sentence for stealing bread, an act he committed to feed his hungry family. Despite the severity of his sentence and the many years he spends in prison, he remains a man rejected and scorned by society. Upon his release, he finds that society views the law and punishment as a measure of a person's worth. For many, including the unyielding Inspector Javert, Jean Valjean is forever branded a criminal because of his past. However, Jean Valjean's path is marked by a fundamental change. One night, he is taken in by the Bishop of Digny, who shows him true mercy. When Valjean is found with stolen silver in his bag, the bishop forgives him and even tells him that the silver is meant for his redemption. This act becomes the turning point in Jean Valjean's life, starting him on his desperate quest to free himself from his past and atone for his wrongdoings. Jean Valjean's journey is one of redemption, both moral and spiritual. Throughout the novel, he dedicates his life to charity and faces the challenges of a society that continues to despise him for his past. Yet for Valjean, striving for a better life is not only a personal effort, but also a means to escape the unrelenting laws of society, which prioritize punishment and retribution, leaving no room for forgiveness or compassion. He becomes a symbol of the idea that true redemption comes not from the punishment of sins, but from the ability to repent and change. In contrast to Jean Valjean stands Inspector Javert, who embodies the belief in unyielding law and order. Javert is unwavering in his belief that the law is infallible and that there is no room for mercy or forgiveness. This leads to his tragic end, as he cannot reconcile the fact that Jean Valjean, whom he has spent years pursuing, has been redeemed through mercy and forgiveness. Javert's rigid adherence to the principles of law leaves him with no other option but to take his own life. Hugo's portrayal of justice and redemption questions the distinction between earthly justice and divine grace. The worldly justice, based on law, is often harsh and unyielding, while true redemption can only be achieved through mercy and charity. The novel challenges readers to consider whether the law is always just and whether it allows for human error and the possibility of improvement. Ultimately, Les Misérables demonstrates the transformative power of grace and redemption, asking what true justice really means. Jean Valjean's journey from a despised convict to a revered benefactor highlights the possibility of moral and spiritual renewal that can be achieved in a person's life when they embrace the opportunity for repentance and forgiveness. Jean Valjean is undoubtedly the central figure in Les Misérables, and his transformation is at the heart of the entire novel. The story begins with his imprisonment for the crime of stealing bread. In 1839, he is sentenced to 5 years of hard labor for attempting to steal bread to feed his sister's hungry children. However, this crime does not just lead to a single conviction. Due to several failed escape attempts, his sentence is extended to a total of 19 years. The harsh, inhumane treatment he endures in prison deeply scars him, and the man who emerges from this experience is marked by bitterness, anger, and a sense of injustice. When Jean Valjean is finally released from prison, he bears the stigma of a criminal, making it almost impossible for him to live a normal life in society. The doors of every town and home are closed to him, and he is shunned and despised. He faces this hostile world with distrust and resignation, but his life takes a dramatic turn when he meets the Bishop of Digny. The bishop gives him shelter during a time of despair and even saves his life by offering him a chance at redemption. The bishop's act of mercy and compassion changes Valjean's perspective, and he is urged to start anew. The bishop offers him the gift of forgiveness and asks him to live a better life. This act of mercy and kindness becomes a turning point for Jean Valjean. From the bitter, lawless man he was, he transforms into an honest and compassionate individual, deciding to give back to society and atone for his past wrongdoings. He begins to change his life by adopting a new identity, becoming a wealthy and respected businessman. As Valjean, he even becomes the mayor of Montreuil-sur-Mer and dedicates himself to the well-being of the people, particularly the poor and needy. He becomes a symbol of redemption and hope for others who face the same hardships and injustices that he once endured. Despite his new life, the weight of his past never fully leaves him. The police inspector Javert relentlessly pursues Jean Valjean, seeing him as a criminal who has escaped his punishment. The conflict between these two characters becomes a central theme in the novel. Valjean is increasingly tormented by the burden of his conscience and the fear of his past, but at the same time, he grows into a man who not only develops his own moral compass, but also comes to care for and protect others, particularly Cosette, the daughter of Fantine. Jean Valjean's journey from a criminal outcast to a compassionate and morally upright man illustrates the transformative power of redemption and forgiveness. His story is about a man who is unjustly treated by the system but chooses the path of improvement, fighting against the prevailing structures that oppress him and reflect society's flaws. Valjean's development is a central theme in Les Misérables, prompting the reader to reflect on the nature of justice, law, and moral action. Inspector Javert is one of the central and most tragic characters in Les Misérables. As a hardened police officer driven by an unwavering belief in law and absolute justice, he contrasts sharply with Jean Valjean. Javert embodies the unrelenting, often inhuman side of the law, which overlooks the social and moral dimensions of justice. For him, The world is divided into black and white. There are clear rules, and anyone who breaks them, like Jean Valjean, must be punished. This mindset is the core of Javert's character and drives him relentlessly to pursue Valjean. Javert first encounters Jean Valjean at the beginning of the novel when he still views the former convict as a criminal, even though Valjean has already changed and is trying to lead a new life. Javert becomes an unsettling, almost obsessive presence in Valjean's life, relentlessly pursuing him. Javert represents the inflexible, bureaucratic justice system that allows no room for mercy, grace, or human frailty. Even when Valjean has long paid his dues and proven himself to be an honorable man, Javert still sees him as the criminal who cannot escape his just punishment. Javert's role in the novel is defined by his unwavering stance on justice and his blind obedience to authority. He believes that justice can only be achieved through the strict application of the law, regardless of circumstances or individual transformation. This perspective is in stark contrast to Jean Valjean's, who, throughout the novel, comes to understand the importance of forgiveness, mercy, and personal change. The conflict between Javert and Valjean is not just a classic battle between good and evil, but also a philosophical and moral struggle between two completely different worldviews: the unyielding, rigid view of the law and the more humane perspective that takes into account the individual and their capacity for change. For Valjean, who has learned from his own mistakes and experienced forgiveness, the path to redemption is possible. For Javert, however, there are no gray areas, no understanding of human capacity for transformation. The dramatic climax of Javert's character occurs toward the end of the novel when, after a confrontation with Valjean and a series of profound moral dilemmas, he realizes that his strict view of justice is incompatible with the principles of humanity and forgiveness. In a moment of despair and internal conflict, as he recognizes that he has never truly understood the meaning of grace, Javert decides to end his life. This tragic act is the culmination of his existential crisis and symbolizes the failure of the rigid, law-abiding system he has long upheld. Javert's death is not just the end of his personal story, but also a commentary on the limitations of a society that bases justice solely on severity and legality, with no room for mercy and compassion. Through his character and tragic end, the novel highlights the issues with a system that fails to recognize the human dimension of error, forgiveness, and change. Javert remains a symbol of the destructive power of a relentless legal system that threatens to destroy a person's life, offering no space for personal development or forgiveness. Cosette's story. Cosette's story is one of the central narrative threads in Les Misérables and reflects themes of poverty, love, redemption, and the pursuit of a better life. Cosette is born into extremely difficult circumstances. Her mother, Fantine, a single woman working hard in a factory to provide for her daughter, is eventually forced to leave Cosette in the care of the cruel innkeepers, Madame and Monsieur Thénardier. Fantine, driven by desperation, hopes that Cosette will have a better future in their care. However, the Thénardiers exploit Cosette, treating her like a servant and forcing her to live in dire poverty. Instead of receiving love and care, Cosette grows up in an environment of harshness, where she is abused and mistreated by the Thénardiers. Jean Valjean's intervention marks a turning point in Cosette's life. After learning of the girl's plight, following Fantine's death, he rescues Cosette from the Thénardiers and takes her into his care. For Jean Valjean, who is himself shaped by a life of despair and guilt, Cosette represents innocence and becomes a source of his redemption. His act of love and care demonstrates that true fatherhood is not only defined by blood ties, but also by the responsibility one takes for another's well-being. Jean Valjean raises Cosette in a new, safe environment, ensuring that she is provided for not only materially, but also emotionally and intellectually. Cosette receives a proper education and grows up in a home filled with love and protection, which is a stark contrast to the misery she experienced as a child with the Thénardiers. She experiences a childhood free from the painful hardships she once endured and is nurtured in an environment of care and stability. Jean Valjean treats her like his own daughter, and she becomes his most important responsibility and source of solace. For him, Cosette symbolizes his own redemption, a sign of his capacity for change and goodness. Unlike her childhood, where she endured nothing but suffering, Cosette now lives a sheltered life and matures into a young woman. Her development is not only physical but emotional and intellectual. She grows with an inner desire for a better life, and she becomes increasingly influenced by the world around her. She also encounters love as she meets Marius Pontmercy, one of the central characters of the novel. Her romance with Marius marks a new chapter in her life and a further step into the adult world. Cosette's story is ultimately one of transformation and growth. She begins as an innocent and mistreated child and becomes a self-assured young woman, surrounded by the love and care of a father who gives her the life she deserves. Her journey is a central aspect of the novel and underscores themes of redemption and the ability of an individual to fight for a better future despite overwhelming adversity. She stands in stark contrast to many other characters in the novel who are trapped in a cycle of suffering and injustice. Her development from a suffering daughter to a beloved young woman is one of the more hopeful narratives in Les Misérables and represents the triumph of love and care over the horrors of poverty and injustice. Fantine is one of the most tragic figures in Les Misérables, and her fate is a striking example of the brutal consequences of social inequality and the cruel treatment of the poor in 19th century France. Fantine is a young woman who is abandoned by society and her fellow human beings. At the beginning of the novel, she lives in relative poverty with her daughter Cosette, but with hope for a better future. She works in a factory to support herself and her daughter. However, when she is abandoned by her lover and loses her job at the factory, she is forced to search desperately for ways to survive. In her desperation, Fantine sells her hair and her teeth to continue supporting Cosette, who is staying with the Thénardiers, while she works in the city. These sacrifices demonstrate the dire situation of women in her position, who have no other means of supporting themselves and their children. Fantine is not only physically and emotionally exploited, but she is also dehumanized by society. She becomes a victim of a system that shows no regard for the needs of the poor and treats them as worthless parts of society. Her physical exploitation goes hand in hand with the societal stigmatization of fallen women, who are seen as morally inferior simply because they live in poverty and try to survive by selling their bodies. As she is ravaged by a serious illness, likely tuberculosis, and is no longer able to work, her condition deteriorates rapidly. Fantine has no support left. Her daughter, whom she has cared for so selflessly, is not with her but remains with the cruel Thénardiers. Fantine dies alone and neglected in a hospital. Her final hope, to ensure the safety and well-being of her daughter, is left unfulfilled. She has sacrificed everything and lost everything, yet all of this was in a system that victimized her, never giving her a chance at a better future. Fantine's fate is not just an individual tragedy, it is also a reflection of the social injustices of the time. She is mocked by society when she falls into hardship, and her life ends in despair and illness without ever receiving help or compassion. Her fate criticizes the structural inequality and the disregard shown by those who live in wealth toward the poor and the needy. Victor Hugo uses Fantine's suffering to highlight the effects of social class disparities and the inhumanity of a society that exploits and scorns the destitute. Her life is a heartbreaking example of the cruelty of society and the injustice inflicted upon the poor and weak by the rich and powerful. In the end, Fantine is saved by the actions of Jean Valjean, who offers her aid after she has already fallen severely ill. But her salvation comes too late. Her death symbolizes the ultimate failure of society to give the needy and disadvantaged a chance. Fantine's tragic end is a powerful symbol of the loss of human dignity in a world marked by social inequality and underscores the central theme of the novel, the need for social justice and compassion. In Les Misérables, the June Rebellion of 1832 plays a central role, serving as the dramatic historical event that provides the backdrop for part of the story. This rebellion, which took place in Paris, was a failed uprising by revolutionary forces who rose against the monarchy and social inequality. It was triggered by a variety of factors, including working-class dissatisfaction, political instability, and hopes for profound social change. Victor Hugo uses the rebellion as a significant symbol of resistance against the oppression and injustice of the existing political system. The June Rebellion is depicted from the perspective of a group of young revolutionaries, led by Enjolras. Enjolras is a passionate, idealistic young man who dreams of a more just world. Along with other members of the revolutionary group, such as Marius Pontmercy, he stakes everything on the uprising to change the social and political order. Marius, another central character of the novel, is portrayed as a man deeply entrenched in the political and social conflicts of his time and inspired by the ideas of liberty and justice. For Marius, the rebellion is not just a political act, but also a way to connect his life with a higher purpose, particularly in the context of his love for Cosette, who later in the novel provides him with a new perspective on life. The rebellion is portrayed as a desperate attempt by the young revolutionaries to confront the repressive forces of the monarchy and the existing social system. The barricades they erect are not only physical obstacles, but also symbols of resistance against injustice. Hugo describes the barricade battles with a mix of heroic idealism and tragic futility as the revolutionaries, despite their firm belief in change, are confronted by the superior military power of the monarchy. Their efforts are ultimately crushed, and many of the young fighters, including Enjolras and his companions, lose their lives. In the context of Les Misérables, the June Rebellion represents a parallel to the broader themes of revolution and social justice. Hugo uses this historical event to illustrate the challenges and sacrifices associated with the pursuit of freedom and justice. Although the revolutionaries fail in their mission, they embody an unwavering belief in a better future and the need to fight against oppression, even when success seems unlikely. Their determined stance reflects Hugo's central concern: the call for social change and the improvement of conditions for the poor and the oppressed. However, the portrayal of the June Rebellion is not just a historical account of a failed uprising, but also a symbolic element within the novel. It stands for the ongoing conflict between the ruling classes and those fighting for change, as well as the determination to combat a system based on injustice and exploitation. Hugo emphasizes the discrepancy between the idealistic goals of the revolutionaries and the brutally dismissive reality they face. Nevertheless, the June Rebellion remains a significant symbol of resistance, representing the hope for a future beyond the existing social and political structures. In this context, the rebellion also plays a crucial part in Marius' personal development. Through his participation in the rebellion, he is not only drawn into political struggle, but also into deep questions about life and society. The rebellion, for Marius as for the other revolutionaries, represents a sense of solidarity and sacrifice, as they are willing to risk their lives for a higher cause. Despite the defeat, the resistance of the revolutionaries remains a symbol of the transformative power of ideas and the human drive for justice. Marius Pontmercy, a young revolutionary, falls deeply in love with Cosette, the adopted daughter of Jean Valjean, and their love story becomes one of the emotional focal points of Les Misérables. Marius, living with his revolutionary ideals and passion for social justice, is, at the beginning of the novel, a character whose life is shaped by the political landscape and societal upheavals of the early 19th century. He is an idealistic young man whose beliefs lead him into resistance against the monarchy and the existing power structures. Cosette, who was rescued by Jean Valjean from the hands of the cruel innkeeper in a poor mill, has had a completely different life. Her childhood was marked by deprivation and mistreatment until Jean Valjean took her into his care and raised her as his own daughter. In contrast to Marius, who grew up in political unrest, Cosette now lives a relatively sheltered life, representing the ideal of innocence and compassion. Her affection for Marius is deep and unwavering, but their love is repeatedly tested by external circumstances and the political tensions that shape the society of the time. The love story between Marius and Cosette is inseparable from the political events of the novel. Marius' commitment to the June Rebellion of 1832 leads him into the ranks of the revolutionaries, while simultaneously being shaped by his feelings for Cosette. This tension between his political responsibility and his love for Cosette becomes especially evident when Marius fights on the barricades, while Cosette waits nearby for his return. Their love develops under the shadow of the rebellion and symbolizes the character's willingness to sacrifice. For Marius, Cosette is not just a symbol of love, but also of hope and human connection, a light amid the dark political struggles. The political dimension of their relationship becomes even more complicated by Marius' estrangement from his grandfather, Monsieur Gillenormand. The old man, a conservative monarchist, despises his grandson's revolutionary ideas and is against his love for Cosette, who is linked to Jean Valjean, a former convict, through her background. The conflict between Marius and his grandfather not only reflects the societal divisions of the time, but also Marius' internal conflict between his family, his political beliefs, and his love for Cosette. Through Marius and Cosette's relationship, Hugo addresses the themes of personal sacrifice and loyalty. Marius is willing to sacrifice everything for the cause of the revolution, including his own family and wealth. Yet, when he is with Cosette, he is also forced to confront the emotional and social implications of his political engagement. Cosette, too, must make sacrifices in her own way, as her love for Marius means not only striving for personal happiness, but also being willing to accept the hardships and challenges that come with life alongside a revolutionary. The love story between Marius and Cosette becomes a glimmer of hope amidst the dark world of social conflict and political instability that the novel portrays. In the end, their union represents not only the triumphant power of love, but also the possibility of a better future, one that can be achieved despite the overwhelming burden of societal injustice and the personal trials they endure. In Les Misérables, the role of class and poverty is powerfully and profoundly addressed, as the novel paints a grim picture of social division in 19th century France. Victor Hugo places significant emphasis on depicting the harsh realities of poverty and the class system, clearly illustrating the unjust structures of society. The different social classes are not only separated by economic wealth, but also by the social conditions that are shaped by poverty and exclusion. The poor population, represented by characters like Jean Valjean and Fantine, is engaged in a constant struggle for survival. For them, daily life and access to basic needs such as food and shelter is an ongoing battle. Fantine, one of the novel's most tragic figures, is a poor factory worker who sells her hair, teeth, and ultimately her body, resorting to prostitution in order to support her daughter Cosette. Her story highlights the extreme exploitation of the poor and the utter hopelessness that many face when they have no other means of support. Fantine becomes a victim of a society that sees those in the lowest social strata as expendable, stripping them of dignity and respect. Another example of the societal divide is shown through the life of Jean Valjean, the former convict. After being sentenced to 5 years of hard labor for stealing bread to feed his sister's starving children, he has little chance of reintegrating into society because of his past. Despite his moral transformation and his efforts to do good, he is repeatedly persecuted because of his origins and social standing. The society in which he lives refuses to view him as a man who has been redeemed by his actions. Instead, he is seen as a criminal, someone who does not deserve a second chance. This illustrates how deeply entrenched the class system was in France and how the lives of the poor and outcasts were marked by profound injustice and stigmatization. Simultaneously, the divide between the wealthy and the poor is depicted not only through material differences, but also through the social norms and expectations that individuals carry based on their origins. Characters like Monsieur Gillenormand, Marius's wealthy grandfather, represent the privileged classes who are in positions of power and wealth due to tradition and inheritance. They embody the societal order that sees the poor as inferior and the rich as legitimate rulers. In such a world, it seems nearly impossible for an individual to change their position or escape the cycle of poverty and exclusion. However, the novel also notes that despite this deep social inequality, people from different classes are capable of fighting, changing, and seeking a better future. Jean Valjean's efforts to avenge Fantine and provide a better future for Cosette as well as Marius's participation in the June Rebellion of 1832, are examples of the aspirations and hopes of the lower classes to fight for improvement in their situation. The novel highlights the need to combat social and economic inequality and place the needs of the poor at the center of political and social attention. The depiction of poverty and social injustice in Les Misérables serves as a powerful critique of the society of the 19th century and the inhumane conditions under which the working class and the poor suffered. Hugo urges readers to confront the structural injustices that permeated society and to create a new, more just world in which the poor and excluded are seen not only as victims, but also as actors in their own transformation. Jean Valjean's redemption forms the core of Les Misérables and represents a central moral and spiritual transformation that runs throughout the story. Valjean's journey from a convicted criminal to an honorable and selfless man is a powerful symbol of redemption through grace and compassion. The story begins with Jean Valjean as a bitter man who, after his release from prison in the year 1890, faces rejection and mistrust. As a former convict, he is outcast by society, and life for him seems like an endless series of hardships and setbacks. However, his encounter with Bishop Myriel, who offers him a second chance, becomes the turning point in Valjean's life. The bishop shows Valjean unimaginable kindness by not only offering him shelter but also returning the silver Valjean had stolen, telling him to use it to lead an honest life. This act of grace opens Valjean's eyes and inspires him to change his life. Valjean's development throughout the novel shows how he takes responsibility for his past actions, seeks atonement for his sins, and dedicates himself to the welfare of others. His decision to raise Cosette as his own daughter and to seek justice for Fantine's death are just a few of the sacrifices and noble actions he performs to improve the lives of others. However, Valjean's redemption is not simply a matter of outward actions but also of inner transformation. His experiences with Inspector Javert, who insists on holding him accountable for his past crimes even though Valjean has morally changed, highlight the conflict between law and grace. While Javert views the law as infallible and final, Valjean understands that true redemption can only be achieved through forgiveness and the acknowledgement of human weakness. This moral understanding ultimately leads Valjean to inner peace and culminates in one of the most poignant scenes in the novel, his death. When Jean Valjean finally dies in the year 1833, it marks the pinnacle of his redemptive journey. His death follows a long series of personal sacrifices and self-denial, and he dies at peace, knowing that he has contributed to the betterment of the world. Through his love for Cosette, his selflessness in helping others, and his acceptance of his own humanity, Valjean achieves redemption. His death is symbolic of the transformative power of compassion, repentance, and the possibility of forgiving oneself, regardless of the severity of past transgressions. In this narrative, Hugo demonstrates that true redemption is not obtained through the immutability of laws and punishments, but through the willingness to change, to receive grace, and to forgive others. Jean Valjean's journey from a broken man to a symbol of the power of forgiveness is the true heart of Les Misérables and stands as a plea for human change and the realization of justice through compassion and mercy.